So it's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote of the workshop with Kristina Lyons. You have seen from her abstract and presentation that Kristina is an assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So she's come all the way to us. It's fantastic. I would just want to probably know Kristina's work if you've been interested in more than human relations with soils, but many other perspectives that Kristina's work encompasses. Probably you know her paper, Decomposition as Life Politics, Soils, Selva, and Small Farmers Under the Gun of the US-Colombia War on Drugs, which is in cultural anthropology. And I wanted just to read that title because I think it shows the richness of Kristina's work and the richness of the how she renders the very complex and entangled relations of human soils and politics, geopolitics, and justice, injustice, life and death in relation to soils in the context where she works in the Amazonian selva, and in relation with how science has approached the soils in the selva, which actually I think would you accept that selva is translated as jungle, but it's not jungle? Maybe you can explain later the questions, because selva is obviously a Spanish word. So you can read a lot from her CV and her webpage, so I won't go on to that. But maybe even looking at some of the titles of her work, of her papers, and her also blog entries, presentations, interventions in other many outlets, can tell you more again about this kind of writing that Kristina does, and something that I would like to emphasize. So I didn't know you had this post, The Poetics of Soil Health, which is a beautiful title. And I was looking at it, I didn't know about this text of yours, and I was thinking, wow, that's a beautiful prolongation of the discussion we're having here about what can be soil health. You can see also that, again, the question of soils and peace, how soils are entangled with the peace, non-peace processing in Colombia. I was very taken by the stories that Kristina was telling about the farmers being fumigated from the sky with these pesticides that are supposed to kill the coca plants, and which are funded by the US war on drugs, but that kill actually everything and affect the farmer's soil, every plant. And so this is the kind of context with Kristina operates. So just again, what I wanted to maybe say about the things that are not written maybe in your CV, but they are written, but something more personal I want to say. When I met Kristina, I think about 8 years ago, one of the things that was really striking for me is her engagement and involvement, and how she's entangled in the communities she works with. And probably many of you have heard about the new motto for staying with the trouble. And I think it's not only about staying with the trouble in cases like what Kristina does, it's about getting involved with the troubles and being really involved in how do we actually, we just not go there and try to just neutrally describe the troubles, but being involved as researchers. And the other thing is Kristina's writing. And Kristina has this, she told me at that time, because we were talking about writing, and she told me, oh, I do creative writing and poetry. At the time I hadn't read anything of what she's written, but if you read her work, you can actually see that there is a work of writing in it that is pretty amazing. And in a way, like we were discussing yesterday a bit about using the word ontology, not using it, and you could say that in a way her texts don't write about ontology, but do ontology. She doesn't write so much, she writes about the selva concept and with this notion is, but also makes selva with her writing. And that's something that I invite you to experience where you go and read. But we'll not further relay the moment.
So thank you so much. That was a really beautiful introduction. I want to sincerely thank the organizers of the workshop, Ana, Greta, and Maria, for the invitation, all the logistical support, and for building this soil care network that's emergent and holding this cross-disciplinary workshop. It's been wonderful to learn about people's research today. It's been really exciting, and I'm honored to give the tail end talk of the afternoon. So I begin my talk with an important conceptual lesson taught to me by an animal husbandry technician and small farmer in the Indian Amazonian foothills of Colombia. And as Maria briefly mentioned, this is a predominantly rural frontier region where I've been conducting ethnographic fieldwork and accompanying agroecological popular processes since 2004. In southern Colombia has been an epicenter of what was until recently the country's official over 50-year social and armed conflict between leftist guerrillas, paramilitary, right-wing paramilitary organizations, and state armed forces, as well as a continued focal point of militarized U.S. Colombia anti-narcotics policy since the late 1990s, in particular, as Maria mentioned, aerial fumigation operations, in which a concentrated formula of Monsanto's herbicide glyphosate was recurrently sprayed over entire landscapes in efforts to eradicate what have been denominated illicit crops.
So I'm not a native speaker and we have a bit of background noise, therefore there's always the risk not to understand if you speak not so much up or a bit quickly.
Okay,
so please be aware of this situation.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Native speakers are.
I support the motion.
Okay, I will slow down.
Speak louder.
Speak
louder, slow down, this combination.
Okay, great. So this is a mural painted by youth in the state of Putumayo, which is the Colombian Amazon, depicting life before and after aerial spraying. So it just gives you a sense of the impacts of this glyphosate, this chemical warfare, in a sense. So this farmer friend of mine that I mentioned, Heraldo Vallejo, explained to me that modernizing agricultural practices and neo-colonial legacies of violent extractivism have alienated rural communities to the point where, quote unquote, they do not know where they are standing. I would quickly learn that not knowing where one is standing does not refer to knowing the soil through a laboratory analysis of its chemical fertility, pH level, or scientific taxonomy, or necessarily knowing any kind of stable entity. Indeed, Heraldo demonstrated how rather than sending a soil sample off to an urban-based laboratory and paying for its chemical analysis, farmers could compare the soil where they intend to cultivate with fecund animal manure on the farm. Applying hydrogen peroxide to both the soil and the manure, and then comparing the intensity of the effervescent cackle of microbial life was one way to determine whether a soil is healthy and apt for cultivating. The reason to avoid consulting a soil science laboratory is not only a question of reducing costs and external dependencies in a precarious present farmer economy, where rural communities rarely have access to such technology. It emerges from the ontological differences between treating soils as a stable container for crop nutrients or a natural body that can be routinely chemically manipulated, and interacting with soils as living worlds that are inextricable from their ecological relationalities, and thus shifting relations of forest nutrient cycling, decomposing litter layers, and microbial and insect communities. In fact, as Heraldo engaged in the experiment with the manure, he explained to me that it was not a question of knowing, but rather of learning how to cultivate and also to recover and reclaim different practices, aptitudes, dispositions, and affects. His emphasis on open-ended processes of learning that do not result in the accumulation of universally applicable knowledge reveals a tension that he and other farmers I met have with not only the agricultural sciences and their ties to productivist market imperatives, but also with the category of knowledge itself, when it is separated from learning as a humbling, shared, as a multilateral and not only human, ongoing and situated process. This is not because these farmers entirely reject the teachings of soil science, ecology, or microbiology, as rendered evident in my anecdote about relating to chemical versus biological soils. Rather, Heraldo and other farmers I accompany interface with these agrarian sciences and their technological apparatuses by subjecting them to the rigor of local demands, visions, and agroecological conditions. Scientific practices that on the one hand support farmers' liberation from capitalist imperatives and extractive-based logics, and on the other, responsibly address and emerge from Amazonian-based problems, may be incorporated into their agricultural life projects. Simultaneously, these farmers engage with specific practices they learned from their parents and extended family members, and ones they continually learn and recover in their exchanges with neighboring indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other peasant farmers, as well as with specific endogenous seeds and varieties of plants, trees, and animals that have been introduced into the region and demonstrate what they call adaptive potential. For example, one day Araldo told me how his Nasa indigenous neighbors taught him to plant in fields recently struck by lightning, because these fields become more fertile. The Nasa had reached this conclusion by witnessing the upsurge of mushroom caps after a storm. Araldo later read a scientific explanation about the way nitrogen molecules are shattered by lightning bolts, fertilize the air, and then penetrate the ground in falling raindrops. This was a case, he explained, where popular practices matched up with scientific ones. However, there are innumerable popular practices that have no scientific equivalent and that form part of or are actively being reincorporated back into farm and forest life. The recovery and innovational reworking of these practices is occurring after decades when rural communities eliminated most agrobiodiversity in food production to grow a monoculture crop, namely commercial coca. I echo other colleagues, especially feminist scholars working at the interfaces of science studies and anthropology, when I ask after the possibilities that may emerge when agro-environmental sciences push beyond simply selecting pieces of quote-unquote alternative or popular or indigenous knowledges that appear to match up with scientific knowledges. How do different ways of relating to soils, including what may or may not be enacted as a scientific object called soil, produce differential economic, political, and environmental policies, legal structures, technological innovations in forms of territorial ordinance? Or put another way, what kinds of potentialities germinate from different sets of human-soil relations? Relations that may also unravel or destabilize concepts of the human and of soil and of their hyphenated parent. These questions and their stakes are always profoundly situated at the same time that they are critically planetary. Or better yet, rather than assume a singular planetary scale, we might imagine the planetary scales that are enacted in situated relationships with quote-unquote soil. For example, if industrialized and chemical conceptions and treatments of soil emerge from a history that is ecologically bound up with the violence and depletion, which we currently know as anthropogenic climate change, and a geologic epoch referred to as the Anthropocene, these soils, industrialized and chemical ones, form part of the very conditions that made what we know as the Anthropocene possible. However, we should not assume, as Claire Colebrook points out, that if the Euro-Atlantic world and capitalist global economy had simply realized that centuries of colonialism, plantation slavery, intensive agriculture, fossil fuel extraction, and warfare would be so destructive of nature, plunder large numbers of humans at the expense of others, and leave a distinct geological record, then non-contaminating and more egalitarian ways of acting in and upon the world would have become more prevalent. In a similar vein, neither can we simply trust that if modern soil science had known that its disciplinary hitching to industrial agriculture would have enduring negative consequences for its object of study and care, and pose severe obstacles for the soil's public recognition as an environmental and not only political economic resource, then the genealogy of the discipline would necessarily have been different. Whenever we hear alarming statistics and read panic headlines about the accelerating degradation of the quote-unquote world soils, I suggest that we also ask what the world soils includes. For example, the health of what are considered to be agriculturally unproductive soils that no one is interested in monitoring. The ongoing histories of dispossession that sever certain peoples from their territories and lands. The violent structures through which property claims are being made and perpetuated over conventionally fertile and geopolitically strategic soils. And taking a step back even further to ask where soils are being enacted as stable objects and where soils do not emerge as such, because they are never separable from a relational continuum of human and other than human life. The stable, meter-deep, mineral-rich, and fertile soils that could be relied upon for limitless resource extraction and economic growth, harvest after harvest of calories and profits at the hand of chemical input substitution, was always a specifically situated and never universalizable soil. It is this soil, precisely the recognition of the limits to assumptions about an unchanging and standing reserve entity, which concerns over anthropogenic climate change aim to find technoscientific and other kinds of solutions to rescue and fix. This might be the rediscovery of soils that our workshop title references. However, I am inclined to ask, what can we learn from soils that never became industrialized soil, that undermined and escaped dominant taxonomic classification, that have always been transitional states rather than stable entities or solid ground, and that resemble litter layers and decompositionally retire rather than lend themselves to relentless production? What practices are attached to these soils or non-soils? What worlds are these practices attempting to reclaim, build, and imagine? At Aldo, and a growing number of small farming and indigenous communities that I've accompanied are not trapped in an either-or world that pits knowledge against belief. Neither do they make a multicultural or hybridist move to simply place scientific practices that are quote-unquote locally appropriate in analytic and material symmetry with alternative or popular practices. Scientific practices, even when they responsibly address Amazonian problems, are categorically and not only relatively different from the kinds of practices and practitioners that emerge when one lives, dies, and defends a territory under military duress. For these communities, modernizing agricultural sciences can easily become parasitic. They run the risk of rearing their colonial heads when they are deemed knowledge that absorbs non-scientifically derived practices and or renders them obsolete under the capitalist imperatives of standardization, competitiveness, and intellectual property. Neither do these rural communities and alternative agricultural networks seek to democratize science. In other words, opening inclusive spaces for what are referred to as ancestral, traditional, or popular saberes, wisdom or know-how, within neoliberalized science policy culture, or placing soil science at the disposal of the interests of civil society, as though a dualistic division exists between the two. The promises and practices of democratization may or may not take on relevance, and there are always situated political and social processes rather than universal aspirations. This is heightened in a context where communities are criminalized due to their presumed engagement in illicit economic activities, their environmental activism and political mobilization, and the fact that they live in territories which are also zones of war occupied by paralegal armed groups. By illicit economic activities, I refer not only to the cultivation of illicit crops in Colombia, Afghanistan, and other war-afflicted countries, but also to the incremental criminalization of a whole variety of food production, commercialization, and seed propagating practices vis-a-vis neoliberal reforms. These reforms are reshaping national agricultural economies and legislation in favor of multinational corporate seed chemical conglomerates. This criminalization is evident in the persecution of Creole seeds, as well as of individuals found to have uncertified or unselected and hence illegal seeds in their possession, and the prohibition of the production, breeding, and commercialization of Creole hens, artisanal brown sugar, and raw milk, to name only a few recent examples in Colombia. On the one hand, this criminalization is not altogether new. Historians of science have taught us that the production of scientific knowledge has always entailed its constitutive outsides, not only in terms of the making of the category of science pitted against religion, superstition, and belief, but also in the simultaneous appropriation and marginalization of diverse practices, and hence worlds, that continues to allow scientific practitioners to make claims to authoritatively know a singular reality, such as what is and what is not a good and productive soil, a better breed of hen, or an improved seed. What may be newly emerging are specific conceptions of life, and not only human rights or land rights, that have come to the fore in recent struggles over extractivism, GMO seeds, biofuels, and other forms of industrialized agriculture, large-scale infrastructural projects, free trade agreements, and all sorts of neoliberal reforms privatizing public goods and services by fomenting transnational capitalist growth. Of course, development has always signaled more than just material progress and economic growth indicators. It has marked a historically specific model of judgment and control over life itself. Many rural communities perceive that a war is being waged against them, a war that does not declare itself openly as such, but that continues to strangle out small farming families, economies, and livelihoods under the banners of efficiency, advancement, inevitability, and industrial partnership. Agrarian-based movements in the Americas and beyond have learned important lessons from the territorial thinking and ethical underpinnings of the struggles of their indigenous and Afro-descended counterparts. More than attachment to land understood in terms of delimited plots of property managed by a nuclear family, conceptions of farms are increasingly informed by exercises of popular territorial ordinance, in which farms are also forests, watersheds, wetland areas, community seed banks, integral gardens, orchards, home to wildlife, and potential ecological corridors. It is the defense of farms as more than farms that I have begun to call agro-life processes. Small farmers in the Amazon taught me that in order to, quote unquote, what they say, decolonize their farms and resist what they call an agriculture of death, they first have to decolonize dominant, techno-scientific, chemically conceived and market-oriented notions of and relations to soil. The thin 5 to 10 centimeter layer, arable layer composing much of the Amazonian plains, or what upon first encounter appeared to soil scientists more litter layer than soil, is a kind of ally in these agro-life processes because the litter layers, or hojarasca, is indifference to extractive-based forms of agriculture, lead it to withdraw and appear or play dead after a few harvests once tropical forest cover has been felled. I understand this to be not simply a mechanical cause and effect interaction or biological breakdown of the soil, but rather the sheer physical force and capaciousness of fragility. The feeding loop of activity and withdrawal characterizing an ecological relationality, in which soils and forests are interdependent through their processes of nutrient cycling. And I think you can viscerally detect this interaction in the photo of a typical Amazonian soil in the plains of the Amazon. Thus, while certain modern agricultural technologies are actively incorporated into farmers' life projects, when these practices enable liberatory potential within the relational conditions of an Amazonian ecology, asymmetrical engagements between practices remain ethically and strategically important as a political, or better yet, life proposal. This is an asymmetry that subverts the authority granted to scientific knowledge and its nexus with capitalist forms of accumulation over a myriad of other, or not only, scientific practices and anti-non-capitalist ethics. By not only, I take inspiration from what anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena conceptualizes as excess, or that which is performed past the limit. In this situation, that which performs past the conventional delimitations between science and non-science. These kinds of asymmetrical engagements, and here I'm trying to problematize and think about the limits to post-colonial STS moves towards symmetry that have characterized much recent literature that's putting science and non-science in analytical material symmetry. So I think that these asymmetrical engagements and the importance of paying attention to asymmetry as a political project are attempts to resist the appropriation of popular practices by different scientific disciplines, while acknowledging the historical and ongoing debts these sciences owe to the worlds they marginalize and marginalized. Farmers' decolonizing processes may produce partial alliances with soil scientists. However, they also maintain tensions. They do not assume fixed positions of subjugation or subversion, and they entail processes of unlearning and relearning, recovery and reclaiming. As feminist philosopher of science Isabel Stengers reminds us, the word reclaim points to the need to heal, to recover from devastation. I understand reclaiming to be a situated and not an abstract or simply critically reflexive process that entails a coupling of regeneration and struggle from within wounded spaces, where diverse ways of being, knowing, and imagining have been foreclosed by singularizing narratives. Inspired by Stenger's commitment to support the reclaiming processes of scientific practitioners and their partial manner of relating with the world, the specific reclaiming processes that soil scientists are engaging in indeed what many of you may be engaged in from your respective positions, seems integral to our workshop in Emergent Soil Care Network. What practices are being reclaimed at the same time that scientists confront humanitarian pressures to respond to accelerating soil degradation? How are soil scientists attempting to work against the way soils have been reduced to a singular economic vocation when they are professionally positioned within structures that tightly link state and capital? What spaces of articulation can be cultivated between scientific practitioners from within a disciplinary legacy that prioritize chemistry and physics over biology and microbiology? How are state scientists visibilizing a concept of soil health at the same time that national development models depend on intensified resource extraction, austerity, and conservatism? During my fieldwork with state agrologists, or state soil scientists, at Columbia's National Geographic Institute, Agustin Codazzi, otherwise known as the GAC, and with soil microbiologists at the Agrarian Microbiology Laboratory at the National Biotechnology Institute, IBUN in Bogota, I witnessed scientists struggling to counter what they perceive to be the soil's troubling anonymity with environmental legislation and policy, and to a larger extent, national and international public spheres and social imaginations. The IGAC organized a natural resource campaign that converted 2009 into the National Year of Soils, and led to the passing of a resolution declaring June 17th National Soil Day in Colombia. Pon tus pies sobre el suelo, place your feet on the soil, was the campaign's closing motto. The motto was suggestive on various material, figurative, and ethical levels. From a corporeal invitation to sink one's bare feet into earthy humus, to a call for a renewed awareness that humans and other creatures live not stranded on a closed surface, but immersed in their mutual permeability and binding accountability with an open one. During campaign events and my fieldwork as a laboratory assistant, I often heard soil scientists remark about their own marginal status and the limitations placed on the kinds of experiments they could design and conduct, and the soil use recommendations they could make, due to their institutional affiliations, funding sources, modern taxonomic system, and dominant development paradigms. The failure to convert the soil into a matter of broader public concern was distributed across object and subject, nature and the social. Explanations ranged from the excessive use of agrochemicals and deforestation to misappropriate technologies, the soil's lack of quote-unquote natural charisma, poor planning and territorial ordinance, private property structures, and what were more generally referred to as conflicts of over and underuse. And indeed, these debates about the root social causes of soil degradation are familiar to many of us here. When I attended the Latin American Soil Science Congress in Costa Rica in 2009, a diverse range of scientists held public discussions about the ontological crisis of the soil. They were generally perplexed about why their complication of initial minimalist conceptions of the soil by the 1920s towards their current scientific definition as natural bodies and living systems had not successfully translated into more robust policy mandates, dominant economic practices, and conservationism. What had they done wrong? Who or what had hijacked the soil? How had the soil failed its own specialists and spokespersons? The role of capital was only a haunting specter in the backdrop of these conversations, which tended to oscillate between discourses of past and present mismanagement and future improved management, to contain the parameters of the formulation of the problem and its solutions. Only in my more intimate conversations with scientists was reference made to nefarious structural violence, or what one scientist called a soil mafia, that had undermined the possibilities for soils as commons and public good, constitutionally recognized and implemented socio-ecological functions. If many small farming communities and agrarian-based popular movements are engaging in a quote-unquote territorial turn, perhaps better called a territorial opening, that is transforming their relationships to a living world below, then what kinds of openings are soil scientists engaging in? Or might they engage in as they become better able to cultivate cross-disciplinary alliances? How might a greater number of soil scientists learn from peasant farmers, for example, if the latter are not required to perform the scientific equivalence of their practices and know-how? Interestingly, soil science has had an easier time building alliances with artists, or at least employing aesthetic modes of soil sensing in efforts to speak to wider and more diverse publics. One only has to think of the poetry of the late geographer and soil science professor Francis D. Hole, and the beautiful soil profile descriptions of the late pedologist Hans Jenny. In a well-known 1984 interview, Hans Jenny said, "If you are used to thinking of soil as dirt, which is customary in our society, you are not keen to find beauty in it. Just plain dirt has often left soils appearing just plain dead, in some worlds, even if not in many others." To conclude my talk today, I'd like to engage in a speculative ecopoetics that, as Maria referenced, that I refer to as an ecopoetics of soil health. Not because I am convinced that literary genres will necessarily lead to better care of or rediscovery of the livingness of soils, but because poetics help me to complicate my understandings of soil health beyond modern binaries of life and death, well-being and demise, destruction and reparation. So I begin. Optical mineralogy is a gaze turned deeply earthward into seeming dark, still and silent depths. Indeed, when I first peered into a petrographic microscope at Columbia's National Soil Science Laboratory, I was slightly disappointed to find myself staring at what appeared to be an unassuming slice of magnified dirt. However, as soon as the polarizer filter was slipped into place, uniform darkness exploded into a kaleidoscope of fuchsias, yellows, violets, and blues. Odd shapes took form, mutated, and then disappeared. Hues shifted in intensity, from shades of light to dark, more radiant and increasingly dull, as the light diffracted mineral particles in the voids between them at different angles. The soil mineralogist who invited me to his workbench that morning registered my surprise and reminded me that this was only the color spectrum detectable to the human eye. He went on to measure minuscule quartz grains and the size of clay minerals, and to note plant fragments and channels that indicate good oxygen flow and porosity. For me, this moment was akin to what Francis Hole described as the aesthetic pleasures of soil watching. For the mineralogist, his optical measurements were important because they could alert to early signs of degradation or other ongoing structural damage caused by climatic forces that are increasingly difficult to disentangle from histories of human use and abuse. If geology tells planetary stories within the life cycles of rocks, and archaeology stories of human activity through the remains of material culture, then soil mineralogy can be said to diffract the granular stories of human soil co-substantiation. I have reflected many times on my initial reaction when peering through the microscope, my impatient desire to see something, and the illuminatory sensations that accompanied the action of light piercing through somber shadow. I have questioned why it was so hard to submerge myself and sink into the soil's darkness, rather than look for the diffractive patterns of minerals, slip into the depths of the voids between. These voids have registered the vibrational motion of water molecules, films, and air, deposited by wind and rainfall, and the compression produced by tractor tires and countless numbers of cattle hooves. They have inhaled with a body that has respired over and over again, often left exhausted and gasping for breath. Through the voids, we can descend into the laggard times of weathering bedrock and the almost imperceptible leaching of one soil horizon into the next, only to extend with roots and sprout with tree seedlings as they strive to become a regrowth forest. This darkness harbors memories of being pierced open and sucked dry by oil wells, converted into property, demarcated by fences, and sealed under the asphalt of urban growth. When I focus back on the minerals emerging and transforming before my eyes, they become microbial remains, rolled over by military tanks, displaced by synthetic fertilizers, and metabolized into colloidal slime that lines the tunnels of burrowing worms. Soils defy modern dualisms between nature and culture, and living bio and the supposed non-living matter of geo. Inasmuch they also trouble modern temporal divides between past, present, and future. There is no final material erasure of the past, in the sedimented and residual fabrics of their recycling bodies. Many rural communities in Colombia and elsewhere say that when a horrible event occurs in a place, the soils, trees, and other elements and beings retain this violence. My colleague, feminist philosopher of science Karen Barad, alerts us that the world holds the memory of all traces, or rather the world is its memory. Co-labor and host to all terrestrial experiments and tragedies, life sustainer, evolving body, grave and trash dump, soils seem almost too resilient and hospitable for their own good. I am reminded of feminist philosopher Rosalind de Proza's writing on the unequal distribution and selective forgetting of corporal generosity. Systematic forgetting results from the asymmetric evaluation of different bodies and the kinds of labor, benefits, and relations they enable. Marxist feminists have paid close attention to the overlooked biological and reproductive processes that form the quote-unquote passive grounds from which capitalist production occurs. A question that seems central to our workshop and network, then, is how might cross-disciplinary alliances that prioritize practices of and relearning and reclaiming work against the selective forgetting of not only the soil's labor and generosity, much of which is extracted by force, but also its corporeal existence, limits, and relational conditions of existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina, for proposing these important standards to contemplate towards
Turn to see the questions. Deep breath.
I mean, it's just a comment. In 1983, I did a tour in Agustin Cadassi.
Oh, really?
Yeah. To look at their soil surveying procedures, and my conclusion, sorry, I'm Stephen Orton, wasn't here this morning. My conclusions were that their obsession with trying to place soils into a North American classification system was pointless. I spent time in their labs many times with surveyors, and out in the field we were looking at soils and we were talking with the farmers, and they were grouping their soils into groups that were based on how they performed for them. We then had to take, following the practice sent down from headquarters, we had to take the soils, look at them, analyse them, and put them into classes. And let's say this was where we'd drawn the boundary on potential use. We suddenly finished up drawing boundaries in this direction. And I remember one evening in a bar, a lot of sunshine was said, what was the point of producing a map that's qualified for exportation to North America, because that's really what they were after, to get their brownie points with their aid supplier, it seemed. When in reality, and when you're on the ground, it bore no relationship to how the soil was used. Now, at the end of my trip, I first of all gave a series of seminars, again a challenge, but then I wrote a substantial report on this. And the director he was furious, because he said, well, I was educated in the United States. I learned soil taxonomy. You're telling me not to use soil taxonomy? I said, well, it's of no value to what you're trying to do. And this, I don't know whether it appears it may still be the same, but in a way they were categorizing soils to have a resource map, but not categorizing soils in relation to improving their use or how they were used. And at the time, I remember getting back on that plane and thinking, well, had my 8 weeks been wasted? Because I felt all the time I was banging my head against the wall. What was the point of producing this soil inventory unless it was to make better use of the soils? We were only looking at agricultural soils. I know the area in the Amazon, deal with that. And it seemed that their purpose wasn't to understand how soils could be used and how they could be managed, but simply to place them into boxes, which is what I wrote in my report, which got the director particularly. So, in some ways, I'm disappointed that 30 years on, they're still doing the same thing. And soil survey is a costly exercise, it's expensive. And if it's not being used to benefit the people who are using the soil, then I actually don't see any point in spending that money. But, you know, I think Agustin Kadazi is typical to other places I've worked a lot in Africa and Southeast Asia. It's the same idea. But no, I'm just saying, as soil scientists, we've been obsessed with working to standard systems, not local systems.
Yeah, no, I agree. I wrote a piece about this in 2014, particularly the case for the Amazon and the USDA taxonomy. And but I would love to read your report actually, which I don't know if it circulated or if it didn't circulate because
no,
the
it's
director
classical grey literature. It went to the sponsors, and of course they didn't like it.
Yeah, I mean this is a problem. I mean, as you point out, like scientists being educated in the U.S. and then importing in the 1970s in Colombia, in the case the USDA taxonomy down, and versus Brazil, which they created their own taxonomy because 3/4 of the country the soils are considered to be unproductive. And in Colombia, they just cut out one of the classes because it doesn't exist, and they left the rest of the taxonomy system. So, but this is something that I'm just now starting new work on climatology, on weather, on meteorology. It's all based on U.S. taxonomy standardization of what is a cloud, what is a, and that doesn't at all fit in the tropic. Yeah, so I mean, we can talk about this more. Yeah.
Hey, I really enjoyed that, and you talked a little bit about the limits of democratizing science as a path forward, and I appreciated that. And you seem to offer decolonizing science as your, as another suggested path forward. So I was wondering if you could succinctly state what you think decolonizing science is or means, or how it proceeds.
Yeah, so, thanks for the question. So, yeah, it's a little bit, I mean, my feeling really uncomfortable with a lot of the STS literature that's thinking about participatory science in the global north is based on this democratization or civic science or citizen science and these concepts that really, like, if you're in a context where people are not considered citizens, they're criminalized. The citizen science doesn't, or democracy has no actual. It's an empty rhetoric. So I don't think that I'm not proposing like that. For instance, let's throw out post-colonial science studies, and because I think that it depends on each space of struggle. There's specific struggles in specific contexts. So in the case of Latin America, which is not a post-colonial context, there is no post-colonial literature. Even like as a genealogy, it's decolonial questions, that decolonizing science in this particular context, like the way that farmers interact with, how they interact with the sciences that are pushed down to them through these aid packets or through green revolution technologies or the aid programs that they get hitched to, or the militarization and development humanitarian projects that come through. That to me makes sense for this. In this case, I think that if you're in a settler colonial context, if you're in a post-colonial subaltern studies areas, if you're in decolonial struggles, I mean, it really depends on where you're situated. It's a specific genealogy, it's specific kinds of political struggle, and it's specific kinds of discourse, but also practices. What makes sense? So that's why I think personally in this context, like democratization of science is not a helpful way to think about.
Right.
Okay. For those who are not familiar with post-colonial science technology studies, can you just like summarize what that is and what your issue with it?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, my particular issue in this is that there's been a real push lately about this symmetry. Like symmetry is the answer. Like if we just put knowledge, so like scientific knowledge and in symmetry with other practices, other knowledge. So I don't like to use the word terminology, even practices, scientific practices with other practices, and we put them in symmetry and in conversation. And then suddenly we resolved a legacy of colonial, of power, of asymmetry, of inequality, And so there's analytical symmetry work, and there's material symmetry, like you can think about actually on the ground how practices. And I think that I've been feeling a bit troubled with that suddenly symmetry is resolving. And actually it's become a way that science studies scholars can continue to colonize other concepts. And because they bring in non-Western knowledge into the literature, and we're going to work with non-Western concepts in a Euro-based science studies, and that suddenly resolves the intellectual, the epistemic colonization. So that's my kind of, and it's not about then, throw out something. I think it depends on each context. It depends on the kinds of conversations that someone yesterday, one of the soil scientists, card-holding soil scientists, said that there needs to be conversations that emerge and how the conversations play out, but I don't think necessarily that symmetry as a taken for granted assumed solution in every context. And actually in this case where farmers are saying, no, we maintain the asymmetry, but it's an inverted one. And that we're placing other practices above science. Science enters in and it helps us think about certain things. It's not the only way of knowing. And it doesn't ever displace other ways of knowing. They see the partial connections with science. And I think that's for me was something to just raise a flag to that. We should pay attention to asymmetry as well as symmetry when we think about what we mean by, if we think about decolonizing science or democratizing science or these other kinds of supposed progressive moves. I hope that.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
And that's been really helpful for me to think through. And I just want to make a point, I don't think it's just limited to previously colonised countries. I think this should apply also within Britain. I think it's a really good way of, democratising sciences and science and participatory resource management has just been seen as the only way that we should go within the UK as well, and I have real questions about that, and I think looking at it through your lens has helped me to understand how we should be thinking about it differently in Britain as well. It's just that citizen science is a panacea for everything at the moment. So.
Yeah, no, I'm glad, thank you, I'm glad that it
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. At one point you spoke about farms as being more than farms. You used the word, what was it, agro-life processes. Can you talk more about that? And how is that related to this territorial turn you were talking about? And is this territory, is it similar to what others would call landscape perspective?
Yeah. So what I found one in Colombia, for instance, like in a 60-year war, it was not possible to talk about things that weren't human rights and international humanitarian law for the majority of the conflict. Like nature, environment was not, wasn't a casualty of war, wasn't a victim, wasn't an actor, it's just the priority was of the human condition, right? And so what I see actually was really interesting in recent years is that the agrarian-based, like peasant movements, not speaking about indigenous and Afro-descendant movements, but have taken this territorial opening that is not just about defending my right to land and my land title and my house with my nuclear family and my means of production, which are still important. It's not to say that these are not still parts of the struggle, but it's actually about what are they defending? It's a defense of life, it's a defense of ways of living, it's a defense of the sea, ways of monoculture of the mind, aka, ¿cómo se llama? Shiva? Of about territory. It's actually that the thinking has to be not just me and my piece of property, an individual property. It's actually we have to think about the territory in the way that similarly to indigenous and Afro-descendant groups have, indigenous communities, historically, but Afro-descendant in a certain time started this territorial move as well. And I think that's when I think about farms are not only farms, because farms for them can be eliminated. Like this farmer that I'm talking about lost 5 farms in the last 25 years from dispossession, war, all kinds of, so it's not about holding onto your farm, because the farm can go, and it's not about even holding onto your own life, because your life can go, but it's about the territory is something broader, and if you build an ecological corridor, that's something different than your piece of property that you can be dispossessed from quite easily, right? Or if you think about how to reconnect with you're in a watershed, you're in a foothill, you're part of other things that's not just about the kind of traditional. And I think that unfortunately the state has trapped. A lot of times I don't see that small farmers have have, to use it for lack of a better word, ontological differences in that they don't just want to become all of them agro-industrial farmers, or just a lack of capital that they just need the, if they just had the capital, they could become. It's not what a lot of small farmers, at least in Latin America that I know, like they're interested in defending something else. And it's not just a rejection of markets either, per se, but I don't know if that, and so that's what I think of as agro-life processes more than like agrarian, land-based struggle.
Shall we end up here and go continue the conversation with the community for our social media?
Sure.